Thank you very much, Moses, and thank you for introducing everyone to the event. We'll be, as Moses has said, working with this small group of documents today. I will be putting the presentation on screen, so you don't need to worry with that one, but you may need to be looking at or accessing script A and script B, which has been sent to you, or as we said, you can access those through the resources button on Zoom or through the chat box. So hopefully there's three ways to sort of access those two scripts, and those will be the main independent materials that you'll need for today. I'm just going to share with you now. So we'll start as we mean to go on, and hopefully you should now be able to see the opening of the presentation. So we're here today to focus on International A-Level English Paper 1 and ways that we can look at delivering it effectively for our candidates and our students. My name is Trace Kenny. I've been working both in education and examining for now best part of coming up a quarter of a century. So its time is ticking on. And what I do like to do is when I am working with the international exam, it is just great to see students approach it in so many original ways and still really effectively engage with the text across the different platforms. What we're hoping today is that we will discuss our assessment objectives and where they fit with the particular examination papers. Obviously, today we'll be focusing on Unit 1, but there will be opportunity to look at Units 2, 3 and 4 in the coming months. We've got additional meetings in January and February of 2026. We're going to work with a series of questions from recent test papers. We've just run a 2025 session last week, but we'll be working with texts from 22, 23 and 24. And we'll be looking at how the question matches the objective and how the students can then access performance at the different levels and access all of their objectives. We will look into how some questions have been answered. So we are going to be working with two key scripts, but also with extracts from scripts and thinking about the examiner feedback from previous series. There'll be a chance to think about strategies for teaching, and this is where it will be things that we would suggest, but also there may be opportunities through chat and discussion to share sort of practice and share ideas that you feel have worked for you. So there is that opportunity for networking as we move through the activities today. I'd like to welcome you all to Pearson at the end of what is usually a very busy term. So we do appreciate you taking the time to work through this training today. And we hope that you do sort of achieve what you hope to through the session. Just a reminder that Pearson does sort of have that large global reach, and we are sort of looking at exams that have carried over a period of time and over a number of countries. And we can see here that, there's a large number of candidates participate in Pearson each year. We'll begin with some general information, and I know some of this is probably quite familiar to you, but we'll just do a quick overview of the course before we get into Unit 1. So obviously the A-levels building up on skills candidates have worked on, whether that be GCSE, IGCSE, or if they've been working on other programmes like IB, NYP. Our international A-level has similarities to domestic qualifications. I know some people may be teaching both, and some resources can be interchangeable, so there is that flexibility. The hope is to blend knowledge and skills and make an integrated and coherent pathway through to prepare students for further study and for their own sort of enjoyment of literature. This particular course can be taken modular. For example, some candidates can choose to stop at AS, or they can take everything at the end in a linear pathway, and therefore it's flexible in terms of approach. Just a quick reminder to ourselves how the entire course pans out. We do have our 4 units examined. We have a combination of open exams, and we do have the sense of an equal weighting across the units, with then some variation in weighting between different sections of different papers. And today, obviously, our focus is Unit 1, Post-2000 Poetry and Prose. Looking at our objectives and how they're balanced across the course, we have our 5 key objectives, and these are sort of commonalities to other examinations offered for this age group. Our AO1, which we will spend some time discussing today, is about the articulation of the response. And what we'd like to be clear with this is that we're not just looking at level of written communication here. AO1 is also this idea of how we shape the argument. So we're looking at how students can use their concepts. Obviously, we're hoping for accurate written expression, but it's this idea of how an argument can be positioned and how the candidate is sort of signposting us through their arguments. AO2, as we can see, is also sort of quite heavily weighted, and that would sort of be obvious. That's our analysis of meaning and how that might be shaped in text, and what we used to call our form structure language. So the idea of, how is the crafting taking place? What is the writer doing? What methods are they using in the different genres? AO3 we will touch upon today with some of the questions, and that is our context AO. And it's the idea of both the written and reception. So the context surrounding the production of the text, and then obviously surrounding the different ways in which it's received. With poetry today, we're going to be looking at AO4, and that's the idea of how we can connect texts. In this case, there will be one that will be presented to the student, and they'll have a free choice of a second poem. We won't be looking at AO5 this morning because it's not in this particular unit, but it is just a reminder that is our critical appreciation, our critical interpretations, and not just those from outside, but how the student uses those to shape their own viewpoints. Looking at AS, for those students who take the one-year pathway, we have that balance out across our AOs, and again, we have that slightly heavier weighting with 1, 2, and 3. And in Unit 1, we're particularly thinking AO1 and AO2 are foregrounded, with AO3 with the novel and AO4 with the poetry. And yet again, just in tabular form, when we move up to the full 2-year course, we can see again our balance. It's mostly AO1 and AO2. When you produce 3 and 4, there is that slightly heavier weighting on AO3. And then our AO4 connections and AO5 critical interpretations still sort of form a significant part of the marks. And today, with WETO1, we're mainly focusing in the first section 1, 2, and 4, and then in the second section 1, 2, and 3. I've mentioned that the AOs are fairly common across other qualifications to give a sense of parity and equality of the qualifications that students achieve. Those who are UK-based, it's an UPQual requirement for fairness and clarity, and so students are aware of in which domains they're being tested, and it creates validity and a standard outpoints for those who examine, as well as teachers and candidates. So our main focus this morning is WETO1, the post-2000 poetry and prose. It's one exam of 2 hours with open book but clean copies only. We have an equal split of marks, 25 for each section. And we have, as we're going to look at in a moment, that choice of 2 questions where the candidates can select one. On the question, they will be given one of their poems of the decade, and they're invited to choose another poem from the selection. And we will stress that because although things have improved in that area, we do still occasionally see candidates who select a poem outside the set prescribed poems, and unfortunately those cannot be recognised or awarded. They must be the set poems, so it's a point to warn them of before they go in. We will be looking at a series of examples of questions from different sittings, and we will be thinking about how best to get candidates to approach those. In section B, we have the 5 novel choices: Kite Runner, Life of Pi, White Tiger, Brooklyn, and Purple Hibiscus. And again, we will be taking a range through some of those questions. As with the poetry, there will be a selection from 2 questions, and they need to do 1. So starting with post-2000 poetry, we're going to look at a series of 3 questions across 3 sittings. You might want to consider as we go which of the questions you might have selected to do if it was yourself. Obviously, in one paper, we have 2, but we're looking at 3 across, as we said, different papers. We're thinking about best selection of second poem, and this is something that we come to again and again. Students often do want to show us what they've practiced and what they're confident with. We do occasionally have a situation where they may select a poem that's not the most appropriate pairing, and then they're working very hard trying to link that poem to the one in the test paper, and it's creating sort of an additional level of challenge. So one of the things we need to ask candidates to consider is the sense of productive pairings, and we'll think about that as we look at these questions. How might we begin a response? So this idea of the AO1 and the setting out of the argument. We're not quite demanding a thesis as we may get in other qualifications, but we do want to get a strong sense that the student has a viewpoint about how a particular topic is presented, and we should hopefully see that coming through early in the response. with chat, we might not be able to compare full responses or full introductions with other delegates, but there may be an opportunity if people wish to share their views and their thoughts in the chat box. We can see sort of a range of approaches, and maybe if people have come at it with original perspectives. So the first one that we are considering, it's the question on Vicky Fever, and the question was on the gun. So it was about exploring violence. And we do need to remind candidates of that key point of exploration. So the term violence is deliberately broad, and we're thinking about maybe those types of violence that we might be referring to. The gun itself could be a symbol of violence. There is the sense of the responses in the household to violence. So the sense that this character is feeling a particular stimulation from the violence and the response to that. There is also the sense of how it changes that mood and that atmosphere and how it's reflected through language. So the set poem, we can sort of think about those aspects and then begin to think about, the development of the theme. How does violence first appear? Does it affect the domestic setting? And how does that writing style change as the poem progresses? Language and imagery is always a key focus, and other poetic techniques. And if we're thinking here, where would we pair? Many candidates, for example, decided that Giuseppe would be a powerful pairing with this. Some explored texts such as the Lammas Hireling, and it's Pampas Grass was another popular choice. And it's the sense of that portrayal of a violence and moving beyond just the violence itself and thinking about sort of the commentary it's making or what they believe the purpose of the poet was in presenting this attitude to violence or this perspective on violence. And we have a slightly different question here. It's Burnside and History, which can in itself be quite a demanding poem. And I would just ask you to note that it says how poets make use of the natural world. So candidates just need to be very careful when they're looking at the steers. We don't just necessarily want to cherry pick or identify those particular techniques presenting the natural world. We're also asking, how is he making use of it? Again, how is it being used to convey a particular message, particular point of view? With this one, again, candidates sort of maybe had to think carefully about their choice of where they're finding that natural imagery. And we did see a relative diversity here. So you may, for example, some candidates chose to look at particular sections of the woman's body in Eat Me. Some people brought up Lammas Hireling. We had the idea again of Giuseppe being sort of a surreal vision or a corruption of nature. So this one perhaps did pose its own challenges and was perhaps not as popular with candidates as the other option. But there is the sense of this making use of a natural world. So poems that maybe had a heavy reliance on natural imagery, potentially the opening of Look, We Have Come into Dover. It's the sense of how that conveys the message or how that presents a particular point of view. And it's that sense of potential oppositions within a poem or how maybe in this case the poet or speaker is expressing an idea that they're struggling with within themselves, and it just required that little extra moment of thought for the makes use of section. And we can see the steers remain the same. So we're looking at how is this theme developed, moving beyond just sort of summarizing the poem and looking at those tonal shifts, looking at maybe structurally where this is reflected. Points of language and imagery will obviously underpin the work, and looking for those poetic techniques, not just feature spotting, but thinking about actually where are they contributing to this sense of the natural world's presentation, and then further on from that, how it's making use of it to convey or further the message. And we have another one that potentially can be challenging from the Journal of a Disappointed Man, and it is the idea of exploring work. And once again, the word explore, it's inviting candidates to sort of come at this from their own point of view, to build an argument about not just work in itself, but views on work and maybe varying attitudes towards work or how work is presented maybe for two different groups of people in this case within the poem. He seems to be in awe of the workers, but as well feeling alienated by them. And the sense again of where would we make comparisons. So for example, you may have out of the bag, you're thinking about, representations of work in some of the various set poems, and the themes remain the same. So the idea of language and imagery, this should be quite familiar to candidates from previous work, and it shouldn't sort of pose them too much difficulty, but it is this idea of using it to further the argument, and that's the key change, that's the key shift. So not only are they being asked to identify or recognize these characteristic points, but then use them in support of a particular argument or particular interpretation of the question. So it's a sense of taking this and covering aspects of form and structure, covering language choices, covering how writers work with imagery, symbol, or motif, rhyme and rhythm. But we do urge that note of caution. We don't need sort of an endless sort of pointing out of where the rhyme or the rhythm or the structural patterns are, unless they feel it's relevant to the question. So if they are going to make those discussions of rhyme, rhythm, or form, always try and get them to tie it back into a point that they're making about the exploration of, in this case, work or the presentation of something. If these are things that you're working out how to map through with the units, theme obviously is going to come through, and tone and mood. The idea of voice is quite key. It's a key discriminator for the higher levels. The sense of the voice that's coming through. Do we have a dramatic monologue with a speaker with a clear personality, or do we have a voice or a point of view coming quite strongly? And if so, how is that being conveyed? We have the sense not just of the particular perspective, but as we said, those tonal shifts as well, and particularly looking if there's a degree of irony being conveyed. So thinking about how these concepts are delivered, and different centres approach this in different ways. Is it a case of front-loading main features and then applying them to poems? And if, for example, in the delegate pack, if we look at the materials for the delivery and the support materials, there is a booklet, and it does maybe suggest this approach. It suggests, spending maybe 8 or 9 lessons and exploring those bullets, exploring theme, tone of voice, but maybe matching them to particular poems where it's a particularly strong characteristic, and then asking students to apply it themselves to other poems. Some delegates have talked about sort of pairing poems from the initial beginning, and sort of asking students to start making that comparison and contrast of features, or working with 2 very different poems and sort of trying to work out how they deal with a similar theme. And then thinking about ways that these are taught, some do still sort of work with the idea of working through those poems and bringing out their features one by one, or as we said, that idea of we start features first and we explore groups of poems together or pairings together to get candidates making those connections from the opening. It will depend on where students are coming from, and we realise that as well. It could be that some of this material is quite new for some of the candidates, or it could be that they are revising or building on quite a strong base of existing knowledge, and they're just applying it possibly to this new collection. Thinking about advantages and disadvantages of models that we use. So we're not necessarily saying that we need to make radical changes to what we're doing, but thinking about the benefits and the drawbacks of particular models. So if there's a benefit with teaching features first, it may be that it maybe gives the candidates that toolkit for approaching other poems and gives them an opportunity for independent work with some of the set poems. The drawback of that is the idea of not sort of having that security or safety of knowing that we've definitely gone through each poem, and we know that the candidates should realise what they're picking out from an individual poem, and we need to balance that. And there's been times, I know even in the past, where it might even be you teach 2 different groups and you're taking 2 different approaches with them, depending on the individuals in those groups and what works best for them, and also overall aims. There may be a different approach taken with a group if they're taking this for AS or for the 2-year course. But it's about sort of thinking about it and being willing to review it every so often. So we will be looking in a little bit more detail at just go back, I've overshot, the question on please hold. So we're going to spend a little bit more time with this one. And again, if we can just note how the steer is doing a little bit more than saying just look at frustration. It's asking, can we explore the experience of frustration? So, what the candidates are being asked to do there is identify those moments of frustration, but then also look at how they're being portrayed. Is there a particular persona in this poem, for example, where we sort of see the growing frustration as the poem continues? Some interesting angles that candidates took. They considered the source of the person's frustration, whether they thought it was the automated message, or some people potentially quite unfairly began to blame his wife in this experience. But it's the sense of this experience of this frustration and how it's being conveyed through the language, through the structure. And we're looking at those key points, the theme and how it's developed, how we're seeing it through language and imagery, and other techniques that are sort of helping support or draw this point through. So we're going to think about, before we even look at whole essays or before we use sort of model essays for assessment for learning, taking candidates through that sense of the exam walkthrough, if you like. And we know that we say until we're blue in the face that planning is important, but it's this idea of basing an activity on planning itself. So we're thinking this one through ourselves, but as a view to something you might do with your candidates. So you could begin this in a number of ways. You could begin, as we will, with a model from the mark scheme. We're going to work with 6 of the bullets. There's actually sort of 8 listed in the mark scheme itself, which you will have in your delegate pack. I'll put them on the screen as well. But the idea might be that we begin with it and we interrogate it. So we look at it and we can either use the existing bullet point steers to find quotation or reference, or to look for particular techniques, or even begin to sort of relate it through to a second poem. And not be afraid, get the candidates to actually work with those mark schemes as tools for assessment for learning. So get them to look at a previous mark scheme, see if they had other viewpoints or other points that they felt were not covered, because we do always say, all relevant responses should be awarded. Ask them to check their understanding of the bullets that have been mentioned. And as we said, it could be a potential search and selection activity, or expanding out to choosing that second poem and finding the similar features in the second poem. So it's the idea of using mark scheme as a plan or a planning tool, or to give it as a model to students as this might be what your plan would look like before you begin to write. And that idea then of giving them something that would structure an argument. And that's taking students to those slightly higher levels. If we're thinking about moving through to 4, where we're beginning to be controlled, through to 5, where we're discriminating and moving towards evaluative writing, the plan is key. If we can get ideas organized into various points of argument, and then the features are used to explore it, rather than maybe a chronological approach or a feature-led approach. So as we said, it could be used, mark scheme, purely as a revision aid. We could take those bullet points out from the indicative marking and use them for candidates to help prompt them, to remind them what might be in a particular poem. But we can also say to them, what would you improve? What would you add to it? We might ask them to develop their own plan from scratch and to peer review. So we asked a few minutes of silent planning and then swap with peers. As we said before, we could expand or extend these plans, design a table, and actually add quotations or references from a chosen second poem. Plans could then be written in other ways. They could be sort of popped onto a flashcard with sort of the quotation or the reference on the reverse, and it could be used almost like sort of a game of revision, in those final sessions. And then the other thing we can do, we can take working from plan backwards, and we can think about generating new questions or similar questions to give further practice. And of course, we can use a plan to actually write an essay. So things that possibly would have come out. So if please hold was experience of frustration, and if we take an example that was quite popular, many candidates did use chainsaw versus the pampas grass, things that could have been drawn through. Obviously, we're looking at maybe points of diction, words that may express the frustration. In please hold, speaking of the countless options. The imagery and symbolism. So the sense of the robot or the automaton, and what comments are being made about society. Is there a wider frustration about the direction that we're going in? Our poetic techniques. And once more, it's not just kind of the feature spotting, in this case, the sibilance, but the sense of then building that into the sense of the frustration building or simmering and what that's showing about this persona. The rhyme, the verse, the repetition. Most candidates did this pretty successfully. They were able to speak about the growing frustration developing and boiling over into anger as we had that level of repetition. And the verse, the idea of where the verse is maybe shaped and also where the rhyme and rhythm may contribute to the effect. The creation of voice. And we want to go maybe just beyond it. It's first person, the sense of the reporting of speech and how that also conveys that level of sarcasm and frustration. And, thinking about particular examples to point out. And then bringing it together, the overall effectiveness of this expression and any complexity that they could find. So as we said before, some candidates made some interesting points and interesting inroads into, what was the source of his frustration? Was it primarily the automated voice, or was it the domestic setting and the building frustration at the two different viewpoints of the husband and wife? Another popular question from 2024 was a question on harsh experience based on Eat Me by Patience Agabi. This one, a popular comparison was Giuseppe in terms of the idea of something quite brutal. But candidates actually found a good range of poems to compare this to. So they thought about things that characters have gone through and personas have gone through in the poems and how this is presented. So as a kind of practice, if we are thinking about the harsh experience in Eat Me, if that's a poem that we're familiar with, if people do just want to start using the chat function, and we'll not say you need to make an entire 6-point plan, but if everyone would like to maybe contribute, say, 2 points they would possibly put into a plan. So if we think about how the 6 points for please hold, so the idea of an example of diction, an example of the imagery, an example of technique, an example of what you might say about voice. If we can think about then, if we did something similar with the Agabi poem, if we have maybe 1 or 2 contributions each on chat, so if you just sort of pop into chat where you might start, where you might encourage a student to start, if we had this idea of this plan. So thinking, is it something to do with language and diction? Could we start asking them to look at a particular aspect of form? Is there something we could look at in terms of other poetic techniques that are quite characteristic in the poem? So if we could just have a moment or two, and if people sort of have a little moment of bravery, and if you just want to pop some thoughts into the chat box, and then we can sort of share those responses. Yes, basically for the lens, we're saying any of the lenses. So if we're thinking back to the previous activity, we've got that list of possible foci that we might have. So it could be that you're picking or you're highlighting an aspect of imagery. It could be that you're highlighting an aspect of form. So just if we were imagining that we do this with our candidates and we were giving them some guidance or some examples. Yes, so we have there, for example, the extended metaphor and the shipwrecking. And we can go further with that one as well, can't we? And we can think about those images of power and control and the harshness. We begin with the harsh experience and then we can sort of take that further, explore that further. So thank you. Estelle? And as we said, Mark, if we're even before we get to a set poem, if we can think about just a potential plan or steers you might give for Eat Me initially. And it's worth considering. I mean, if you're thinking of your own candidates, do you feel there's a particular second poem that they would probably be minded to compare it to? You know, is the one that you think that they would move towards? Yes, so we have the representation of the italics as well. So those elements of sort of graphology and our sound effects of the assonance as well. So we're getting this idea of some of these techniques and the oral effects. And thinking of a paired poem, what would suggestions be if these were your candidates and you could give them a hand, which obviously we can't when they're in the exam room? Where would we feel that one of the natural partners would be? Yes, so we have there a suggestion of the gun, chainsaw, and Giuseppe. You know, we saw a lot of those. Yes, Giuseppe, and interestingly with Giuseppe, most candidates handled it very well. A few candidates struggled with that idea of the representation of the experience. So they were able to talk about the sort of the harshness of what was being depicted, but they sometimes potentially struggled with how it was being depicted. So it was interesting. We saw a wide range of responses using Giuseppe. We saw some that were very tuned in and very careful in terms of looking at the nuance and looking at that sense of objectification, dehumanization, and the sense of this experience and how and in what ways it was harsh. Some candidates actually even went further and they thought about this idea of the immediate situation of the violence, and then also this sense of this person somehow also being damaged or changed by their participation in it as well. So we saw, as I said, a wide range of responses. Where candidates occasionally struggled with Giuseppe, and we don't see it as much now, but we do still see it occasionally, is they could, in terms of summary, the event happening in the poem, and this is why it was harsh. But sometimes at the lower range, they were kind of struggling to relate, you know, how the poet was achieving that, so to get the idea across. Yes, deliverer was another one that I believe, you know, we had some powerful responses with that as well. The sense of that complete almost throwaway and cruelty. And this is this sense of the narrative perspective. And I think that's an important part you've raised as well, Mark. If you led with this idea of narrative perspective, you've already got an essay that's got sort of a powerful argument coming through. So you've decided, I want to say this about to whom is this done and what's happening. And you're getting into that idea of the perspective right from the outset. And that can take the candidates to those levels. You know, they're beginning to show discriminating and evaluative work if they're thinking about that notion of perspective and how it actually impacts the way we're interpreting the poem. So we're not saying that it necessarily works with every question, but as you've mentioned, this idea of this impact, to whom was it done, we're beginning to unpick, we're beginning to think of that idea of exploration. And that's what we're hoping the candidates will do as well. You know, we're hoping that they'll make those decisions and make those considerations. And we've sort of worked through some of these points. What we had with this, as we said, is candidates were very keen to tell us about Eat Me, and maybe there was maybe a slight lack of balance on their second in some indications. We can modify the task, we can flip it round, we can choose another poem. We did mention this at the start of the session. We still occasionally get this sense that someone's got a poem they've prepared and they really want to tell us about, and they will try and sort of work in that comparison, even where it is quite challenging or where it's quite hard to make it relevant. So we're not seeing it as often as we used to, but there still is an occasion where a student is like, well, I've prepared this one, so I'm going to make a poem. Often in interaction of work with the old question, we sometimes the poem they had prepared comparison, but they felt that I know this one and I know this one, and I'm going to put them together. And it's not impossible, but they sort of set themselves some challenges at times. And the meaningful connection is the key. It's that idea, as you say, if we can find a way in, are we saying we're looking at and comparing and contrasting the view or the perspective? Are we comparing and contrasting issues to do with power, etc.? So we're trying to find that meaningful way in. Talking about second poems with students, we can obviously use our past questions. We can sort of ask them to list out or see, compare across class, ask them to silently write one down and see what the variation is between a group. We might get them to make connection grids. And we've said this idea of, do we link things purely through the sense of language? Do we find that there's texts that employ sort of similar imagery or contrasting imagery? Is it a situation of a comparison formally of form and structure? Is it the idea of, as you said, possibly perspective, whether it be male, female, experience, powerful, powerless, looking at, as you said earlier, to whom was this done? To whom, are you the actor or are you the receiver of a particular situation? Thinking about pairing poems, we can go at it the other way. We can deliberately pair up maybe two quite disparate poems and then ask students, would you be able to do this with this question? Would you be able to work this through? We might be quite surprised that they're actually quite ingenious and flexible at this, but it should hopefully illustrate this point that choosing the second poem carefully can really make a difference sometimes in the quality of the response. We've said before, obviously, language choice features quite heavily on the assessment objectives, but also this idea of the other content too. And it's the sense that we're not necessarily needing every single technical feature to be picked up upon. It's the idea that they're evaluating what they work with. So they've found some features. They think that these features are actually helping explore that particular theme or that particular point that the question is raising. And they're more engaged in the idea of this. We say the word personal, but it's this idea of this evaluation, judging and working out and coming to a conclusion about what they feel the poet is saying about a particular theme or a particular topic. And this is where we're saying it links to AO1. So AO1 is much more than just our sort of technical quality of writing. It's the student kind of working out their own perspective, their own point of view, and working that into the response. Those candidates who are achieving towards the top of level 4 into level 5, it's where they've really developed a point of view and interpretation, and they're sharing it in terms of they've worked out this is what they think is happening with the writer's craft, and this is how they think it's conveying particular ideas. We know there's different ways of helping candidates prepare. We do say that obviously with caution, we try to make sure that students are not just checklisting. We are seeing less and less of that. So that's not sort of happening so often now. We're not sort of seeing people sort of working through in a way that we used to see at the beginning. So I think it's not a major issue, but it's one to watch. Obviously, with students who are less confident, it is a good starting point. If they've maybe not managed to sort of identify key features, it can be a start point for that lower or lower mid student, but trying to get them to gain the confidence to move away from that as they move towards the examinations, so that they're beginning to think about the theme or the particular aspect of the question, rather than sort of saying, I must get through several points about metaphors or several points about assonance or sibilants, etc. And then where that also causes a problem is when a student maybe uses them in error. We're not necessarily penalising if they don't know a particular term. We're more interested in, are they able to explore the effect and what's happening. The coverage. It's not measured. We're not saying literally 50-50, but it is this idea about balance. And one issue, based on students being more or less confident about the poems raised in the questions, is that on a number of occasions, we do sometimes see a student writing more on their chosen poem. Obviously that's the one they've revised. And where they're allowing it to dominate, it's not then really answering the question set. So it's being aware that while we're not necessarily expecting exactly 50-50, they will know whichever poem they've selected to do, but they must try and keep a balance with the poem that appears in the test. And they must make sure that they're driving through with the sense of both of the poems in mind, and working with both of the poems. And there's still occasion where if they've picked a question and they may be less confident with the poem in the question, you get a small amount on that and then much more on the poem that they're showing confidence with. But that will obviously then impact marks, particularly, when we're looking at connections, it is going to go lower for that. And we're just saying, making sure not necessarily 50-50, but trying to sort of achieve that balance or keep that balance in mind. We don't stipulate how candidates do it. Some candidates do still prefer a fairly linear response and making then the comparisons as they go through poem B. Those candidates who seem to write with confidence do tend to work with an integrated approach. So as some of you suggested in the previous activity, they may link the poem through a formal aspect. So they may decide, I'm going to look at aspects of diction, then I'm going to look at aspects of imagery. And as we say, we're not saying one is necessarily better than another. Obviously, an integrated approach, you're showing connections straight away, but there is a way that you can do it if you do choose to focus initially on one, but then bring your comparisons out through the second one. But the idea would be that it's what works for a particular student, particular question. The linking at least makes sure that we've definitely got AO4 in mind, so it does have that benefit that the candidate keeps that in mind throughout. But the idea is keep focused on the question. Forms of linking are crucial. We don't really mind how that link takes place, whether it's sort of referring back retrospectively as they work with poem 2, but it is the sense that the links must be kept in mind and the question must be kept in mind. And endings, obviously, we sometimes have a problem with the poetry. So they have sort of worked through and they've thought, well, I've worked through sort of a series of language points, form, structure. I've worked through some theme. And not every candidate then gets to this point of sort of making a conclusion. And we know potentially it's timings, potentially we know we need to move on to section B. But it's this idea about in the planning moments, people talk about the killer close, and we wouldn't say go as far as having a prepared ending because we can see those as well. But the sense of being ready to finish what you've started and making sure that you sort of respond and work your way through. If in doubt, candidates can revisit the terms of the question, although we're saying if we just simply rephrase the question, that's not going to be as successful. But at least it's sort of beginning to think about, did I address the words of the question? Have I got an answer to this? As long as it's quite a reasoned response, we do want to see that opinion there. We don't necessarily need the first person I, but it's nice when the candidates have sort of come to a final judgment and they, they think this is what the poet is up to, or this is the poet's purpose. So we have an ending here. And again, interesting just to sort of see thoughts. It was from 2406, so not this year, but year before. It is the harsh experience question. It was paired with Giuseppe. And we're thinking about, two elements. We're looking at this ending and we're thinking, in what way might it be seen as effective, or if not, why not? And we're saying, that there might be things that we can credit here, and then there might be areas we would tell the candidate to look at or work on. So looking at this as sort of an ending to a comparison of Eat Me and Giuseppe. And the question is on harsh experience. If people want to just sort of share their thoughts, we're thinking about in what way might we say this is effective? And we're going to say there's some effective work here. And then maybe a second comment if we had to sort of advise the candidates any way in which they could maybe improve or refine what they've done here. I might think of things like, are they keeping the question in mind? Are they giving us a view? Are they keeping connections in mind? Okay, so we've got no specific reference to Eat Me in the conclusion. So that would be an easy fix, hopefully, wouldn't it? But to say, make sure you've referenced both. There is a reflection on question. It's offering a judgment, but in balance. Yes. So as we say, we do have a sense of the question in mind, harsh experience. We have a judgment, but as we've looked at, there's not a full balance here. It's kind of as we feel the end of a Giuseppe point. And it could be timing, we'll be fair, it could be a timing issue. I think, just on that one, to be fair to the student, we have said eat me could be in presence there. There could be maybe it has got a judgment or a point. The idea of conclusion touching on the impact, what do we take away? Is it a conclusion? What is learned? I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Mark. That's the thing that they'd begun to touch on impact, but they hadn't sort of, if the question is how have they explored or how have they presented this moment of frustration, it's the idea of what is learned. And I think that could have just been right at the end. We could have got that. So we could have had reference to both poems. And then, as you've said, just extension of that conclusion. And to be fair to this candidate, they were not far off. This came from a response that did score well. It did score in level 4, but it could be the difference between what's a 4 and what's a 5. So it's this idea that they were very nearly there, but we just had that lack of balance. And you've hit that exactly. Conclusion, what is learned, what do we take away? So it's this sense of the so-called, as they call it, the killer close was just not quite there yet, was it? We had a reasonable articulation of what they felt was being presented to us, but it's the so what, isn't it? It's the answering that question. It's the evaluation part that just wasn't quite there. And it could be something that candidate could adapt and refine. If we saw an essay like that during term time, we just need to give them that tiny little push, just a reminder to them for have we looked at both, and a reminder, have you done the so what? Yes, I think this idea of reframing it and where do we go? The idea of this, where has it left you? Where do we go? And leaving the examiner with that idea that the candidate has engaged with it, and that the candidate has thought, this is my final thought on what's going on here or what's happening here. And I think this is it. It doesn't need to be necessarily a long conclusion, but it needs that level of balance. And I think in that particular example, that section on Giuseppe almost belonged sort of in a body paragraph. So that section could have actually been a little bit more succinct and a little bit more sharply focused on the point they were making about societal constraints and societal experiences. We do have, don't worry about locating the mark scheme. If you're struggling to locate the mark scheme, I'll put it onto the screen now for this task. This is sort of leading us to, you'll be pleased to hear, a momentary well-being break that we're going to have at the halfway point. We're going to look at a whole response. We're going to try and think about where the response might be placed. And you can go for an exact mark if you wish, or you can go for, secure, tentative, within a level. But we're going to sort of look at a reading task. We're going to sort of have a look at script A. We're going to sort of give you some reading time with it. So it's a complete answer to the question 1. And it's thinking about, if you can just think of a level, if you want to give it a mark, that's fine. But think of a level and why you might choose that level. And I will just break the PowerPoint for a moment, just to kind of take us to the mark schemes. So just for a moment, a few things we need to look at. It is our question on please hold. So it's an answer on please hold and on her blindness. So this one, if you're obviously wanting to sort of read at your own pace, if you've not got the copies sent out, there is a copy of script A and a copy of script B in the Zoom in the resources section. If resources isn't showing on your screen straight away, click on the 3 dots, go to resources, and the documents should be there, and then you can sort of read and scroll to your heart's content. What I will do is I will leave the I think it's just disappeared now, but I will put the mark scheme up so we can sort of see what we're working with. And just a quick reminder to us, with our mark schemes, it's really helpful to think about the headlines. So in terms of the overall characteristic, and we do realise that candidates' responses can sometimes be somewhat uneven, or they can build to a level, but we're thinking when we read a text, are we looking at level 1, which we would call descriptive? either with little reference or that narrative approach or some sort of lack of understanding. Moving into level 2, it's that idea of general. And notice even at level 2, we are still hoping for some form of surface reading and some general understanding of writer's craft, some sense this is a crafted text, and some attempt to make general connections. So even at 2, we do still need that. Moving through to level 3, clear is our keyword here, clarity and relevance, so clear and relevant. And it's this idea that we can follow through the arguments, we can see relevance in the selections that candidates have made, and we can see they're starting to talk about how meaning is shaped and crafted. Discriminating is one of our keywords for level 4. Discriminating and controlled. There's a real sense this candidate's trying to shape an argument, shape connections, beginning to look at kind of nuanced or more subtle aspects of craft. And then we're getting up towards a 5, which is what we would call the critical evaluative argument. So what I would suggest we do, we're coming now to 10 to the hour. We can build this in with the form of a comfort break. So if you want to sort of give yourself a moment, maybe give yourself 3 to 5 minutes just to read the first part of script A. So we don't need to look at part 2, we just need to look at the poetry question, and just sort of form your thoughts on that. We can use the chat box to sort of feedback, mark if you feel like it, or a level. You can pick a mark, or if you just sort of feel like saying, I believe it's this level, that's fine. And if we sort of build it in with our comfort break, so people need to pop it and get a refreshment, what we can do is we can regroup at 10. So at 10, or wherever we are in the world, if we keep an eye on that clock. So it's in about sort of 8 to 10 minutes if we sort of regroup. And if by then, if you can pop the level or the mark, if you're feeling like you can give it a mark into the chat box, and then we'll have a quick discussion of that as we head towards part 2. So if we say 10, and hopefully that would give everyone just enough time. Script A, yes mark, and section A of script A. So it's the question 1 on please hold and on her blindness. Okay, so that should be the one we're looking at. That's no problem, Sarah. I know that obviously everyone has many demands. There should be recordings, hopefully. And as we said, hopefully all of these can go out to you as well. And thank you for your work as well. So enjoy your class. Thanks. Bye-bye. Okay, so 10 o'clock, and do enjoy your break. Okay, and as you're coming back, if you want to just pop the level into the chat box. I know obviously it's not a huge amount of time for reading an essay, but where would we imagine that response to be? So, well, thank you, Annie and Estelle. I'll do a quick roundup once everyone's popped the comments in. So at the moment, the thought is around 3 or 4. Any sort of differences to that? Anyone? At the moment, we have clear and relevant. Anyone feel there's a degree of control or discrimination, or anyone feel it's general? So any variation? Okay, so yes, and as you said, that there could be points where it could be more controlled, but certainly it meets relevant. Um, and in fact, what may be pleasing or possibly quite surprising, it is comparative throughout. Yes, so we're talking about if the connections are there, if the comparisons are there. Um, we'll just have that look as we say. So we've got possibly levels, and thank you, Annie, for the reasons with the levels. And I think where you've sort of started to spot the level 4, that is actually where this was positioned. It was considered to be, so quite a few people have sort of gone for top 3, so don't worry if you have gone top 3, but in fact this was considered to be proficient. This was considered to be controlled. I know sometimes, particularly when they're typed, we can pick up on those little flaws and those little wobbles, but in terms of this being a candidate responding in time conditions, it was felt that it did sort of actually work its way relatively securely actually into level 4. So we'll just have a look at sort of some of the comments that sort of were listed for this response. That idea that I think Annie sort of had picked up on the connections. The exploration did attempt to discriminate and did attempt to make a sort of controlled connection. Now, there are times where, as we say, it maybe didn't feel like it was doing it as successfully than other places, but we're thinking about we award where we see it. We're not sort of looking to penalise. The examples were reasonably fluidly embedded. So the idea of where the example did take place, it was embedded within the text. There was a degree of control and there was a degree of precision. So as we said, it may not have been the whole way through, but we do have the sense that there was an awareness of the concepts and they were beginning to be used in a discriminating way. So I suppose it's good news if we were thinking sort of top 3, and actually it's worked its way into sort of a pretty secure 4, as you'll find. It's the sense that actually when we mean discriminating, we're thinking about their choices and where they're choosing the examples and how they're trying to work that into the argument and work it into the response to the question. So we're not maybe expecting that level of 100% critical evaluation, which might be necessary for a 5. We're looking to see where there is control, where there is an awareness of some subtlety, where there is a sense of detail in the example. So if we're sort of shifting our mindset, if we're saying that response actually would sort of reach or would address level 4, and in fact, as we said, it scored quite securely in 4. It ended up achieving a 19. So it was felt that it did enough to meet the bullet points. There was enough discrimination. There was enough a sense of some of the nuances. There was a firm grasp of the idea these are crafted texts. What then, particularly if we felt earlier that we felt it was more like a clear and relevant response, and maybe now if we look again, we can see those controlled aspects or those connecting aspects. The sense of definitely, that lack of balance that we have, we do see that, don't we? So certainly, we're thinking it's clear and relevant, but the fact that actually, the chief examiner P, we felt that actually it did achieve enough for 4. So while it is a little unbalanced, while it does have some issues and it's not always consistently discriminating and controlled, it was beginning to sort of show enough evidence to actually bring itself quite securely into that level. So it was given a 19, which may be good news if we've all been, a little bit sort of harsh on it and sort of thinking it was clear and relevant. And particularly when they're typed, sometimes when they're typed, we can kind of sometimes see the candidate's foibles a little barely, and we can think, oh, the writing is a tad straightforward here or a tad clear rather than discriminating. But where there is evidence of discrimination, where there is evidence of beginning to dig at the nuance, we do award. So it did achieve a 4 and a reasonable 4. It achieved a 19. And knowing that, then what would we do? And I think Mark's already sort of given some suggestions. What would we then do to try and take that candidate further? What would we do to encourage that candidate either to approach that consistent control or even trying to sort of push or aim for that level 5? What would be needed for that critical eye or that evaluative eye? And so Mark's sort of given us some advice on what the candidate could do, certainly the idea of balance, the idea of identifying the device and speaking of it, so looking for that device. And again, this is the point we made about naming. We do try to, obviously it'd be great if candidates are always precise in what they're talking about, but if they've sort of identified the point and they've attempted to make an evaluation, we will credit to a degree. We will credit if they've sort of suggested something. Obviously it's wonderful if candidates are accurate and they can speak of this is a particular device and this is how it works, but there will still be partial credit if they've chosen or selected a reference and they're able to begin to talk about how it works or how it's crafted. Even if they haven't got the precise, identification of the feature, they will still receive partial credit for talking about the feature and evaluating the craft. And that could maybe be a differential for a level 5. A level 5 student, their work will be seamless, it will be cogent, they'll write with confidence, they'll know what they're talking about, they'll always have the right term to hand, and they'll always be able to look at that sort of level of sophistication or that level of nuance. And there's elements, as we said, the idea of balance. And sometimes, we do forget it can be difficult for the students under the time condition, but it's, as we say, always getting them to think about that balance and to think about where they go with it. So the good news would be, as we normally are, we're typically being a little bit harsh on those candidates. And we're thinking now about that's probably good news in terms of our own candidates as how we prepare. And then to get to that 5, the sense about structuring the response is important there. So you're raising a key point. If this candidate had produced a more structured evaluation, performance may have been clearer. It may have been easier to make an award. And the sense of the sophistication. Sophistication, as you say, has to come through AO1 as well as through AO2. So it's that idea that preparing and getting candidates to think about structuring their argument and getting candidates to think about how to shape those connections, it can be that key. It can be the key difference to raise them up to the highest levels. So we have that something to sort of carry back to them. But also, in one way, realizing that if they do enough to raise a few points about a discriminating example, or they are able to really hone in on craft, it may carry them over into a 4. So it may take them beyond the 3. And that's the key point. It's being able to explore those points. We've had our breaks, so we'll ignore the break slot there because we've done that in the other order. We're moving now towards our section B, which is our prose post 2000. So we're looking now at part B of the responses. And again, just reminding ourselves here, we're not looking at AO4 now, we're looking at AO3. So we're looking at how do we employ and how do we integrate context. And it is the sense of what we do with the context. So obviously we're looking to see candidates understand these relevant contexts, but notice as well, we say significance of and influence. So we don't need sort of pre-prepared chunks, so to speak, and sometimes that can actually hold a candidate back in terms of how they're responding to a text. And remembering what we just said about the poetry response, it actually went beyond clear and relevant, but to get clear and relevant, we need that relevance. And there is a danger sometimes with context work that if candidates can't make it relevant to task, it will dampen the answer, it will dampen the performance of the answer. And we'll think about, how do we sort of work context in sort of a meaningful way. So currently, these are our 5 contemporary novels. We've got Brooklyn, Kite Runner, Life of Pi, Purple Hibiscus, White Tiger. Kite Runner is still by far and away the most popular choice with candidates. Purple Hibiscus is gaining ground. We do see still a fair amount of the other tasks. The one that I think we don't see very many of usually is White Tiger, although we've seen some fantastic responses with that. It's choosing one from 2 questions, as we've had before. And we have the sense of the key features that we might look at. So as we had with poetry, we have a decision whether we sort of front load these and teach these through extract work, or whether these come out naturally as we work our way through a particular text, some of which, are hard to avoid, if we're looking at characterization. Form and structure, it's quite an important aspect. And the idea of the big picture, how the novel moves through certain settings, how the writer has sort of structured certain aspects within the whole narrative. And the candidates who can get to grips with that, they really are beginning to perform at that 4 and 5 level. They really are beginning to show control of their material and critical evaluation. So if they're able to take that step back and think about not just that character in terms of how they develop along their own narrative arc, but thinking about the way the text is structured and the way, for example, it might move between settings and for what purpose. The way that you might use your analepsis, prolepsis for various purposes. Again, thinking about, what's the decision behind a certain shift, for example, if we have those time shifts, and formal aspects as well. So again, looking at broad strokes, not necessarily where we sometimes see candidates almost prepping an extract and doing it line by line, but thinking about narrative methods, where there is, again, those shifts in discourse, where you might move from one method to another, where, for example, dialogue has been employed for a particular effect, and then where it moves to a more introspective approach. Grammatical structures, again, we're not saying we need it for everything, but it may become relevant to a particular question, to a particular example that a student's trying to give. So that we're obviously referring to in terms of particular references. It may be of use and it may be relevant. Certainly with most texts, we are looking to see, can they discuss with confidence the idea of key imagery, symbols, and running motifs through the text? And candidates are usually quite secure with that on their chosen text. With the language choices, again, always relating it to the question. So we're not just indulging in sort of word level work, which sometimes we do. Sometimes we get candidates who are very well versed in some of the micro aspects, some of the individual techniques being used, but they're not really secure at relating it back to a particular question. So language choices are relevant and they are significant, but only so far as how they relate to the task that they're doing, and how they actually develop an argument for the task that they're doing. And that's where, as we said, a bit like the overall structure, the sense of voice becomes an important distinguishing aspect. So if candidates can talk with confidence about types of voices in a text, so it could be how a character's voice is developed or crafted. It could be sort of authorial intrusion. It's the idea of voice or voices and where those are presented. And then the questions, we're not going to try and trip anyone up. They will be a range, and we usually may have a question that possibly might focus on a particular character, but always thinking about their significance to the overall narrative, questions on theme, or there may be an explicit technique question. And with only 2 questions, that there'll be a combination and sort of different aspects offered in different years. But you'll often see that there may be, for example, a character question, and the other question may be on a theme or on a technical aspect. So we have the full exam paper in the pack. Don't worry about trying to find it, by the way. We're going to put most of them on the screen. We're going to work our way through and think about these questions. And what we essentially have here, we have our statement, and it's designed to encourage that critical engagement. So in this paper, remember, we're not looking at AO5, that's in later units, but we do want that sense of the students' informed engagement with their text. And therefore, they're offered a quote or a steer, and then we can unpick that steer, and we can use some points in it, maybe problematize them, to get the candidates working at those. Again, we're thinking, how do we get from 3s to 4s or 5s? We're thinking about being discriminating and not just sort of accepting everything. So this first question, nothing was quite as it seems. It is this idea of kind of unpicking the terms of a question and thinking about it before we even start to sort of launch into looking at the text itself. And the point here is presentation of. And occasionally at the lower levels, or particularly if it's a candidate who's getting stuck at a level 3 and then they're not really moving on to that level 4, they do sort of miss the significance of the presentation of. So while they are talking about crafting techniques, they're not sort of discussing the idea of the purpose of this presentation. So what you might get with a candidate, which would be sort of a typical maybe level 3, they might address extracts or examples from within the text of appearance versus reality, but they're not getting under this idea of how is it presented at that exact time and for what purpose. And that's kind of maybe capping them at the 3. You know, certainly the material they're producing is clear, they're providing relevant examples, they're able to talk to an extent about some crafting that's going on, but they're not thinking of that idea of that big picture. You know, why is Martel presenting this particular theme or opposition in this way at this point in the story? And it's a complex text, and it's a sense of, you know, what is happening at the particular moments they've chosen and for what overall purpose, you know, so they do need maybe a good grasp of the whole text and the framing of it as well. The relevant contextual factors, you know, we do again stress to candidates, do make sure that it's relevant. You know, there is that desire of a student to try and let us know what they know, but it's keeping it relevant to the question and not using material that's sort of superfluous, because if anything, that slows an argument down, and it actually makes a judgment in terms of, you know, is the material clear and relevant if we've got these large chunks of context not directly related to a particular question. So we'd again urge candidates to resist the urge to sort of present everything they know about their background, historical, literary, etc. But if it is something they think helps expand upon or discuss the idea of appearance versus reality, by all means do. But, you know, what we sometimes see with Life of Pi, candidates occasionally go off on digressions. So if they're looking at Pi and his unusual approach to religion, they start giving a sort of background to many world religions, and then we sort of lose the question there somewhere. Number 6, vividly imagined places, is a technique question. We're looking at the use of setting. And the few we saw in this, we saw some very able responses actually, where they didn't just merely sort of look at and talk about the crafting of the setting, but they thought about obviously symbolic function, but the way it helped him tell the story. You know, so we saw some quite successful work on that one. But again, it's this idea of the use of or presentation of, and it's remembering that steer. Candidates can just go and see the keyword, you know, they can see setting or appearance in reality, and they could jump straight in without that decider of it's how the author's using it, you know, for what purpose. So it's always the for what purpose that we're trying to keep in mind. And thinking about focusing on how it's presented as opposed to what is presented. And we did say that's the key determiner with the middle and above. You know, if we're going from mid-range and above, it's noticing that the question is about the how. And it's the sense of then, as we say, as we move up the levels to high 4 into 5, the for what purpose, you know, the idea of what's happening here or what's going on. The steer is there to create discussion. And I know sometimes with candidates, it may form a bit of a confusion, and they must remember that the question is the question, but the steer is there to give them something to hook on to. You know, so the idea of nothing being quite what it seems, it's encouraging them to think about possible issues of deception, possible issues of unreliable narrators, possible issues of where we're not fully on top of the information. And it says what they need to do is address the second part informed by the first. So what that basically is saying is they must remember to address the actual question first, you know, so those key phrases, you know, presentation of appearance and reality, or setting in the case of the other question. But certainly they can use that first statement, that first quote or gobbet to inform them or to give them some ideas of where to start. But remembering that the question part is the key focus, you know, in the light of this statement, explore. Thinking about then that idea of this question, Opening and closing lines. So even if we're not sort of very familiar with Life of Pi, if the question is about the presentation of appearance versus reality, when we're asking about opening and closing lines, we're not necessarily saying write the opening and closing lines, but what sorts of things should the candidate be trying to address in those openings or those closers? So the question is presentation of appearance and reality. And obviously some people may know the book more than others, but if we just think about it in terms of question setting and task focus, what advice could we give a candidate for how they open and close the response? I suppose these are just questions on advice we could give students. And if we're not as sort of precise, if we're not sort of as versed on the text, what way could they maybe make sure they're focusing on the how? And how could we maybe advise them to structure an answer? Is there anything we tell them to try to adopt, or is there anything we tell them to avoid? So if pi is not your set text, clearly you may not sort of be there right with the opening and closing line. But if we think about the second two questions below, ways we could encourage our candidates to think about the how, or any approaches for structuring that we'd either suggest they adopt or things they should try to avoid. And again, just thoughts and comments into the chat box. We can have a few of those. And this could be applied to other questions, to other texts. This idea of being asked presentation of or use of is quite a popular part of the steers. So if we're giving advice and guidance, apart from telling them to spot those elements of the steer, what advice could we give for focus or structure? And it does suggest at the top, even if it's not Life of Pi that you've been studying, just in general, the advice we could give candidates. I mean, for example, with the how, would we be telling them to foreground the author or to foreground crafting to keep the idea that it's a construct in mind? With this type of question, do we think it needs a form of a thesis to kind of define those two terms in that particular text? In terms of avoidance, have we got advice on how to avoid being narrative or using too much summary? So it's just sort of something to sort of think about in terms of exam walkthroughs. So obviously we have different texts with sort of different centres, but you might want to do this with your group. You might want to take a past paper, see if the candidate can spot the so-called booby trap, see if they can spot that it's not just asking about the theme. It's asking about presentation of or use of. And if they fail to spot it, obviously that could be the first piece of advice. And then secondly, thinking about the idea of the how. Would it be that there's a particular, we said earlier that checklists are not maybe the best way and they're not the most sophisticated way, but is there sort of a minimum of things we'd expect them to look at? Is it the idea of getting them to think author first? Is it the idea of, as you say, what to avoid or those traps to avoid? Yes, so the sense that we've got of, approaches and things that we could do, so we've got the sense of techniques and then the sense of desired impact. Yeah, opening and closing line work. I think that one, I'll not sort of make people do that one. It would be if it was with your class and it was a text you'd done well, you'd maybe ask your students to sort of think about that idea of the killer close or the thesis in the opening. So we'd maybe not do that one today because it's asking people to do it with a text they don't study. So with the kite runner, we'll be looking at the kite runner question in a moment in the sense of maybe how would they open for a particular question. So that question, please don't worry about it. That would be one we'd use maybe with our students with the text that we're doing. So if we had the slide, we'd ask them to sort of think about that themselves and think about the opening or the killer close. And that idea, as you said, of readers and writers is really important, isn't it? The idea of the writer is crafting, and then the evaluation is that impact on the reader, and how it's kind of taking the reader on that journey. And then, as we said, things to avoid is that overlooking of the main point. It's sort of the overlooking of those use of or purpose of. We'd like to say the answer to this one is yes, they should make a plan. And I know students, that they say it with the best will in the world, but we don't see very many. But it's this idea that even if the plan is internalized, that the sense of having that pathway through. And we're thinking about advice. We're saying, please don't narrate. We say it doesn't mean it stops. Yeah, we said before about checklists and these sort of GCSE approaches. We're not sort of actively discouraging them, but they can tend to be less effective at the AS and A level. So we know that maybe some of the less confident candidates do occasionally still pull through that format where they take the point, they take the evidence and they evaluate it. And certainly, as we said, that might be a way of getting a candidate who's finding it challenging a way in. But as time goes, we want them to think, as you say, more about the idea of a thesis, more about the writer and the reader's response, and encouraging the sense of building their own argument, not necessarily against that quite strict structure. And then this point about opening closing lines, which you would do at a certain point in the course once the students are quite familiar with the text. So thinking about, particularly when time is pressing and we may not be able to do 10 past papers, but they may be able to do some past papers or even sort of prepare by using that sense of, planning an argument, even if they don't get a chance to do it in class. It could be sort of something they work on independently. The sense of establishing a position. So rather than repeating, the I've been asked to write, which to be fair, I think most students do not do. But the idea of if they can have a position on the question, and the position could be influenced by the quote, by the steer, or it could be an entirely different point to do with setting a presentation of reality. So just to be clear on how those sort of steers or initial quotations work, they are there to support the candidate. We don't expect them to refer to them. We obviously do just expect them to deal with the words in the actual question, in the actual explore part. But for students who maybe do like that little bit of extra support, they can give them a way in or a point of view, either to decide that they somewhat agree with or they want to actually argue against. They might sort of feel that they have a different point of view. So the sense of the how and constantly referring back, approaches or structures, linear models tend to be less sophisticated, not necessarily always the case, but when a candidate deals with the text in sort of that narrative or chronological order, it can lapse into sometimes treating characters as real people rather than constructs. So most of the time we'd kind of advise against the sense of the linear model, and we'd maybe consider more thinking of significant moments within the text and selecting those significant moments. The idea of treating different techniques in different parts of the response can work quite well. So in terms of organization, it could be the sense of, different narrative techniques may be achieving different aspects, and they may be responded to differently by readers. And it may well be that actually using that as a structuring device can help students work their way through the aspects of crafting and reception. We do keep saying that they've got to not use the kind of poetry approach with the prose. So the sense of when a candidate is down at word level analysis with lengthy works of prose, it may not be sufficient. And we saw this with, I think, was it in the summer with the lower end, possibly with the question on Baba. Some candidates had obviously been quite confident in terms of their knowledge of Baba, particularly at the start of the text. But we were at the lower end getting responses that were focusing in on some very small examples, but not getting beyond those, or not following, as you mentioned earlier, his character arc. You know, they had sort of a set level of things that they wanted to say about some of the descriptions of him, but it was very much isolated and word level, and no sense of how the character develops through the story, or sort of symbolic function, or any sort of aspect of foil, etc. So the sense that if we do stick with word level in a larger text, it's too much of, if you like, the zoom in. You know, we're too closely in at one particular aspect, and we've lost a sense of it as a whole sort of large narrative structure. And there is a place occasionally for work with word level, but it shouldn't drive the response. You know, it shouldn't be the approach the whole way through. Plans would be useful, as we say. We do see candidates quite often having some form of bullet point or mind map, some sort of visual organizer, and that works quite well. Moving through, having a look at, sorry, just bringing the points up. Yes, the killer clothes for Kite Runner. Yes, so the idea of Kite Runner, really popular text, the sense of the novel and the cyclical nature of it. And we don't quite know, as you say, about Sohrab, and the sense of it leaving us feeling they're trying. And in fact, we had, I think, Mark, I don't know, some of the students gave some quite moving answers about the text in time. So there's some AO3 points about how whatever little moment of optimism the text had, a point of publication that the modern reader is not always sharing. And that was just a nice little personal element that sort of showed the candidates were really engaging well with that sense of the purpose and what the writer's hoping to achieve. And the redemption arc as well, you know, is really important with Kite Runner. So the sense of, you know, will that happen? You know, the way to be good, you know, will it succeed? And that's what we're hoping, you know, when we see them engaging, we're hoping that that's the types of thing that they try to do with their killer closes. Thinking about other texts now as well, we have, and we are, you know, we're going with the texts that are kind of the second and third, purely because, as we say, there's quite a lot of Kite Runner on the website. So if we go through some of the sample materials, there's quite a bit that's already there with Kite Runner. There is also the exam insights documents for the current sitting, and we do have some Kite Runner on that as well. So we do have sort of a series of bits on the main text, and then this one we're focusing in now on maybe some of the lesser texts today, just for the other answers. And yes, we've said there, Thousand Splendid Suns could work also with that same point. You know, we're saying we don't necessarily need to add it to the intro or conclusion, but where the student comes up with it naturally. It was just a really nice example of a student making a meaningful and relevant context. So they'd made sort of the context points that they'd obviously sort of learned, and then the idea of their context point being that as modern readers, they now have a slightly different context. They didn't have to overlabor it, but it was just a really nice touch of a student who clearly understood the task and had sort of done everything they needed to do in terms of task. And then they just made that point. It's quite poignant that this tech, you know, has already, in times, you know, the optimism looks sadly misguided, etc. So it was just a nice idea of them being aware of themselves in position as reader, or almost in a different position to the original publication date. And you know, as we said, we don't need to overlabor or teach it, but it was a sense of a student getting there naturally, and it's really nice to see. Sometimes it was like, yes, they've got this, they've got the idea of context and readers and writers, and it was a nice sort of natural touch there at the end. Purple Hibiscus, which, as we said, is gaining ground. We have a steer about characters constantly under threat, and the question was presentation of hostile environments. Then we have pushing against boundary, and it's presenting acts of rebellion. So here we can see again, it's two of those present type steers. So we're saying, how are these things shown to us? And then this sense of how do we define hostile environment? And where candidates did it well, there was the immediate hostility of the domestic setting, but they took it out into the society, and then into this wider idea of, the whole country, and what Adichie was trying to say about hostility. And it was done well with those who sort of selected the point. Acts of rebellion, many focused on the idea of the purple hibiscus and the acts against the father. And then once again, we had this sense of, this irony or potential hypocrisy, that he would support rebellion in the wider world, but would kept a very strict home. And, we felt that, students responded well to these. And we're pretty good, actually, at starting to talk about methods. So looking at, not just what is this environment, but looking at how it's brought across. So thinking about how the steer can help. So the STEM should hopefully help students kind of unpick the question. So that idea of constantly under threat, it gave them a sense of what do we mean by hostile. So even if something did not appear to be explicitly a hostile environment, the idea of the building threat, and some candidates dealt with that really well, the idea of it building throughout the text and structurally how she achieves that. As we said, we do occasionally get the problem that candidates like the look of the steer, so they sometimes ignore the words of the question. So we had a few answers where students were using the word threatening, and the question word is the word hostile. So just being aware of that with all of the texts. The steer is there to help, but make sure that if you're referring to key question terms, it's your term from the question, which in this case was hostile environment. And it's just a little earmark thing for them to do when they're sort of highlighting their key terms when they're planning. And then a first part may actually guide students to evaluation, and that's sort of level 4, level 5. And that was the idea of, is it constantly under threat? So some candidates actually looked at moments of contrast, moments of peace, and how they actually then contributed to the shock and horror of the hostility. And yes, some candidates engaged with this idea where there are many parts where it's not hostile, but in which case, how might that be mitigated? And how do we use those points? If a candidate, for example, feels that the steer, is not matching their expectation or their interpretation of a text, how can we get them to use their examples or their views to develop a response? So we're not saying kind of reinterpret a question, but if a candidate goes in and they've maybe not thought of a text in a particular way, and it's how do they make use of their own information to sort of develop a meaningful and relevant response? So it does say, although the steer is not the question, do look at it carefully. In the case of potentially a single word, can differentiate between those who just accept a statement and they could still do well, and then those who actually interestingly maybe engage with it at that critical level, and they don't always necessarily have to agree with it. So thinking about this idea of keywords, and there was sort of a comment about acceptable in the acts of rebellion question. And it talks about, if we had keywords, what would we hone in on? It says, what do we think would be worth looking at in greater depth? If we look at the word often, that might be worthwhile to think about, this idea of those who do not push against boundary. What is acceptable? What does it mean? Acceptable to whom? So if we go back to question 12, we just get a sense of where we can bring in these discussions. So we have sort of quite a long steer here. And if we're talking about candidates unpicking the steer, but thinking about how it helps the question, presenting acts of rebellion, the word often could be clarified, could be evaluated, could be argued against, possibly. And the sense of what is considered acceptable immediately should take them to context. What is or is not acceptable to certain characters for certain reasons, based on their social norms, based on their upbringing, etc. So it's using the steer to help answer the question in sort of a meaningful way or a more critical way. And as we said, this is how you might unpick it with a group. So what do we mean with contexts? Things that we suggest. Possibly we can look at biography, but we must take care with biographical contexts. Clearly they are relevant in the case of some of the choices. And it's the idea of when it relates to the text, or more importantly, when it relates to how it's written or a particular narrative perspective. So we're not just looking at sort of detached biography, but we're thinking about, how it may have influenced a viewpoint, how it may influence the way they present it to us. Likewise with historical settings, clearly with some texts there needs to be a degree of understanding of where and when these texts are taking place. But once again, it's how that might be relevant to understanding or exploring a particular aspect in the question. The social and cultural context, the attitudes and different expectations of different groups. And here we would just warn candidates to take care with the searching, because sometimes that can sound a little bit like a generalization. So we do want them to engage with the idea of what they anticipate or expect particular attitudes to be, or particular viewpoints in different groups. But if they can avoid that everybody phrase, if they can avoid all the people thought this, or try and just get them to temper their points slightly. Many may have thought this, or a dominant view in this society at the time. But if they just are wary about treating everyone as a homogenous group, and I know they've got a lot to deal with, but if they are looking at a particular context which is maybe alien to their own, just taking care with their language and how they express it, so they're not just saying that every single person in a particular group society thinks a particular way, but how maybe it is a dominant viewpoint, or dominant as seen in the text. Literary context can be relevant depending on the question. It can be relevant if we think about, you've mentioned Kite Runner in this sense of a redemption arc, and how that kind of guides the structure of the text. Contexts of reception, again, we take care with this because obviously we are trying to evaluate reader response. So clearly it is key, it is central to a question. But it is this sense of making sure that if we talk about it, we've backed it up with sort of knowledge or research, and that once again, it's relevant to the point. The film director point would be something more for the drama papers for AO5. Certainly, we do have candidates occasionally who lapse over into speaking about the film rather than the novel in some of the prose questions, just something to be aware of. So while film does have value as an AO5 in some of the other papers, we just warn candidates to just be very wary of what's in a film and what's in a book. It's absolutely fine and in fact relevant for students to look at different interpretations, but it's not being tested here, and therefore they've got to keep very clear in their mind the prose text and not sort of the filmic text or other versions. However, there are other units we'll be looking at where AO5, it's perfectly acceptable and reasonable to talk about stage performance or film performance. There is quite a lot we're asking candidates to juggle here, and we know that. There's a lot of things that they need to process. They are going to need to be assisted in assimilating it. We say until our cheeks are blue, please look at the key terms in the text, but it's about doing these little activities from time to time where we unpick or we problematize a steer, where we make sure that we're answering the question part rather than the first part. And it's worth doing as sort of small starters or small exits, just to keep it in mind and keep it at the forefront, particularly when we're leading up to exam seasons. The idea of contextual knowledge and how they present it. And sometimes it can be from class. Sometimes it can be from doing their own resources. And here they've obviously mentioned potentially you might look at some YouTube sources, but with it being a large source, we're just aware that candidates do need to think about the relevance of things they're looking at on large sites. So it might be relevant where Adichie is speaking about her career or her writing, but there may be some less relevant or less credible sources out there. You may ask candidates to do this in the beginning as some form of oral presentation or some form of preparation for reading the text, or at an interim point in the text. It could be that they find another way of presenting their information, either as a flashcard or a quiz. They may link it to a reference in the text. So if we're thinking about making our context relevant, they may think about a particular moment or episode in your text and think about where context could be worked in a meaningful way, and sort of have that two-sided flashcard, for example, where you might have a quote on one side, but then you might have, how this links to, say, the wider world, or how it links to, say, a political context or a historical context. We can work with things like Google Scholar and JSTOR, which are obviously operating at that higher level, and we want them to sort of aspire to that level if they're moving forward to do English at that tertiary level. But it may need a bit of help and a bit of navigation and support. Some schools do choose to work with eMagazine, which has sort of subscription, but is quite recommended. There's good old books on the topics. We will touch on the role of AI and what we're doing to either incorporate or keep it out of the classroom. There are the film versions, which we've mentioned, of course, we try and sort of use with caution. But we did say let's avoid the chunks and the chunks. So we do have, particularly at that lower level, candidates do maybe panic a little bit and they try and get the AO3 all down at once. So we would sort of encourage those candidates to try and avoid that. You know, they're desperate to make sure they cover AO3 and they do just occasionally panic and put everything they know into a single paragraph or in the introduction. It's not necessary. They can work things in, and examiners will be looking for implicit links. So we will be crediting where a candidate is showing knowledge and awareness of those contexts, even if they're not always, hitting them explicitly. And that's almost better than having that chunk, at the beginning that's not really linking to question. Questions about imagery. As we said, we don't sort of want the author's life if it's not linking in with a particular symbol. And just reminding people what the 5 needs. It's those sophisticated links. Okay, AI, which has become the bane of many people's lives. And obviously, some schools, colleges were clearly saying no, and just no place in the classroom. But it is this idea of where it goes and how people handle it. And it could be that it is being used in useful ways to help engage students, or it could be that we use it just to show students maybe a flaw or a drawback with using AI. So what we're thinking here, and some of this has come out sort of in the last sort of 12, 18 months, there is a way it can be used carefully in sort of planning stages, in revision stages. And it can be used in a meaningful way if students are cautioned as to its limits. Or there can be ways if you're suspecting that your candidates are relying too heavily on AI during the course of events, it may be that you actually actively develop an activity to get them to view it with a critical eye. And I think we're almost, this is our activity, but we're almost past this, aren't we? This idea of it's there, students are using it in their own time. It's how do we stop them from misusing? We clearly don't want it on assignments, but is there a place for it, in a class? And it could be quite interesting in terms of what AI can and can't do. So if we just think of this question from Purple Hibiscus, for example, about characters under threat, we could actually actively ask them to put the prompt in and sort of see what it spits back at them. So we could see that, ask them to sort of put in some of the prompt, ask them to put in the question, ask them then to evaluate what they get back in return. So they might feel that some of the information coming back makes a useful skeleton plan. They might feel that it's firing back some nonsense. But I think if we get them to look at it with a critical eye, it will either caution them against using it whole hog outside class, or it will at least present the sense of where it can be a useful planning tool, but where things also have shortcomings. It may misquote quotes, attribute them to different parts of the text. There may be a sense that it oversimplifies certain points. But if this is a problem, if this is an issue where students are sort of relying on various sites quite heavily, and it seems to be the case, it could be that we do a short activity and we ask students to actually engage with it with a critical eye, put that prompt in, see what it spits back at them and evaluate its shortcomings. And likewise, here we may have worries about this. This is beginning to look like an essay, but for those students who are really struggling with models, maybe this is a stepping stone for them. If they choose some references, as long as they are clear that they do not present this as their own work. So it could be that you say, okay, I want you to set up this task, but you're clearly saying that you've done it with an AI prompt, but think about what it throws up to you using your quotations, and then maybe they argue against it or they refine it. So it may have a role with those candidates who are really struggling to form those independent opinions, with the large caveat that they must always recognize or report to or admit to using it, and in fact sort of actively identify that this is not their work originally from their head. And there's just information if this is something that the school is using, or if you're using an education version of the tool, how it might be used in meaningful ways in the planning stages and in the exam preparation stages. Okay, so we're moving through now to look at the section B. We have mark grids, as I say, if they're not readily available, I'll pop the mark grid onto the screen. We'll be looking at script B, which is the complete answer to its Kite Runner. And we're going to think about the level. So I'll just this time actually pop through with this one. So we'll actually have a look at this this time. So we're going with script B, and I think we've got a question 4. Okay. And the question was about behaviour and sense of place, and Hosseini's presentation of social status. I'll just get my head out of the way. And what we can do is we'll just kind of go through the paragraphs. We'll think about what it may or may not do. I'll position a series of devil's advocate questions, and then I'll sort of ask people, as we did before, to sort of posit a level or maybe even a mark. So our question is, as we said, presentation of social status. So the coming-of-age novel, The Kite Runner, explores social status as something that could be lost due to individual decisions that characters make. Hosseini presents it by using Baba as a tool to show how fluid social status is and how it changes as soon as a new culture is approached. It's also shown by how Soraya's family loses status because of one decision she made, despite her father being the decorated general. Finally, Hosseini presents social status as something fragile and easy to lose in a moment's notice, something relevant to modern times. So we have there our brief introduction. We're thinking about, in terms of how the candidate sets out their stall, have we got, for example, some awareness of genre? We've got coming of age, Bildungsroman. There's a clear focus on the question being about social status. We've begun to exemplify, so we have a sense of a few examples, and thinking about, is the writer foregrounded? We have Hosseini and Baba being a tool. So the idea of a character, not just as some sort of real living being, but as a construct. And then we do have maybe slightly looser on Soraya, but the sense that an example of an issue of status. And then overall feeling what they believe the author is up to. So in terms of setting out the stall, thinking about in your mind, if we say, we probably know we're not in level 1 or level 2 here, but if we're thinking about how we work through, we've got 3 being clear and relevant, 4 being controlled and discriminating, 5 being critical and evaluative. And obviously we've got a short opening here, but we're thinking about what sort of characteristics does this candidate seem to be showing, and do they seem to have a good idea of what the question is asking of them and where they want to be heading? So they started with Baba, and they're going to continue with Baba. Baba's social status changed drastically from his time in Afghanistan to his new life in America, and Hosseini uses this to discreetly warn readers to not get too comfortable in environments. At the start of the novel, Baba's described as Mr. Hurricane, since he wrestled a black bear with his bare hands. Admir admits to this perhaps being an exaggeration if it were anyone else, but no one ever doubted the veracity of any story about Baba. This immediately paints Baba in a heroic light, similar to victors in old myths. The fact that no one ever doubted Baba showcases how impressive the man was and how society respected him immensely, just because of his strength and bravery, something that caused him to climb a social hierarchy in Afghanistan, but not in America. Hosseini shows the difference in social status between the two regions by discussing how in America there's a different way to climb the ladder, which is why when Baba and Amir move, they struggle immensely in becoming recognised members of society like they were in Afghanistan, instead being reduced to a mere day manager at the gas station. Hosseini also emphasises how religious and cultural connotations are linked heavily to status, a key example being the divide between Pashtun and Hazara. Pashtun is embedded in the word Pashtunwali, which is a code that Pashtuns are accepted to uphold. Things like honour, namus, is a key feature of this, and Hosseini shows it by making Baba obsessed with the idea of honour. It's shown in chapter 10 when Baba's main concern on the bus is maintaining status while Amir's sick, Baba apologising to the other passengers as if car sickness was a crime. His dedication to image and concept of honour becomes his Amartya, fatal flaw, portrayed when he's nearly shot because of it. Tell him I'll take 1,000 bullets before I let indecency take place. His confidence and insistent manner on upholding honour further establish his social status. As Karim says, these Rusi are not like us. They understand nothing about respect or honour. Not only does it reiterate the previous point about Pashtunwali culture, but Karim indirectly prompts Baba to display courage in front of his people, as if telling him he's above all because of it. However, the notion is not appreciated in American culture, as no matter what Baba does, his loyalty is not appreciated. It's shown in a scene in chapter 8. What kind of a country is this? No one trusts anyone. Despite being an avid customer for 2 years, Baba still asks for ID, something that would never happen in Afghanistan. There, someone would need to whisper his name and a wish would be granted immediately. Social hierarchy in America is different, and Baba's forced to start from scratch, rebuild his image, something he fails to do even years later. By doing this, Hosseini shows a clear divide in how social status is interpreted in both countries and uses Baba to send a message to the audience. Social status is fluid and can be altered depending on culture and circumstances. And again, what we have is the focus on social status, social hierarchy, and moving through the novel. So moving backwards and forwards, various chapters mentioned, various points, an idea there's a contrast in setting. A sense of Hosseini is always kept relatively clear. We come back to Hosseini at the end of that paragraph. Then we move into the second section of the response. So I'll not read sort of every single line out, but you've got then moving on to the Soraya example. So moving on to social status with women. Yeah, so we're thinking high level 4, discriminating control. So we're thinking we've definitely got discrimination, we've definitely got control. If others want to sort of add, are we feeling this? Are we feeling sort of we've got our discrimination? We feel we've got some control here. We definitely think we're past clear and relevant. Would that seem fine? And some we're thinking possibly level 5. So we'll have a look. We'll sort of have a think through. So we've got, as we said, a clear structure. So definitely control of work. We've got a section on Soraya. Moving through similarly to before, a series of examples. We've got points about cultural taboo. So there's a nice working in of context, which is quite nice to see. If anything, and we need to be fair because obviously students are working under time conditions, we're moving through really nicely. And then we do have a bit of a time issue, don't we? He presents it as 2 completely different ideas. So if we remember from the intro, we were promised 3, although we could argue that Hosseini says it's fragile is being argued throughout. So we do get a really good section on Baba, a really good section on Soraya and women and culture. And then we sort of lose what we're hoping for. We sort of lose our sort of third section. And yes, we could have the idea of the treatment of Hassan and how that becomes something to do with the idea of hierarchy and almost allowing people to behave in appalling ways. So we're thinking we've got some 4s and some 5s, so we'll have sort of a look. And just before we do, I'll do a quick look at the examiner report for the paper that we've been drawing answers from. And it just pulls together some of the points that we raised earlier today. So in section 1, when we talked about the poetry, we don't need to sort of focus in so much on the individual poem, but the idea of, where do candidates fall down? If they're focusing on meaning without looking at analysis, that keeps them quite low. Some people did manage to look at a range of methods and have an awareness of repetition. The point we made earlier about choosing the right poem, we had a few unusual choices going against Please Hold, and the candidates made life a little bit difficult for themselves in some of those choices. There is sort of some samples. So this you can take away with you. This document is in your delegate materials, but it's useful just looking at some of the snippets of, for example, a controlled answer. And then likewise with question 2 that we looked at earlier, the eat me question, we've got a small snippet of a level 2 and a comment on what keeps it a level 2. And then again, followed by a reasonably solid level 4. So we've got some points and illustrations of points that you can take away and have a look at. Likewise with Kite Runner, we didn't look at number 3, but there's some comments on 3. Question 4, you've mentioned, for example, Hassan sort of could have been dealt with in this section. There are other issues people could have raised. We've got religion, ethnic groups, the rich and poor, men and women. Lower responses sometimes stayed quite descriptive, that they didn't really move to the relevance of the context. Sometimes, AO2 was not always there. We have here another example, a nice example of the control, and then the idea of maybe where the candidate could move to sort of move beyond and move to the 5. And then we have sort of slightly shorter sections on some of the other novels. For those of you doing Brooklyn, there is an example of a candidate being quite general on Brooklyn, and then a slightly more sort of effective response to the same points. And it's worth looking at. It's sort of worth having a look through. So we've had there a combination of level 4s and level 5s as possible suggestions. If we have a look, if we think about what's the response that it went on to achieve, They felt, as some of you felt, that it did remain, as we say, with level 4. So definitely we could see, couldn't we, the candidates certainly controlled in what they're doing. There was a degree of discrimination, particularly I think it opened quite strongly with Baba and the examples it gave of Baba. Partially timed might have been an issue. We never got that third point that we were expecting. So we got a nice section on one character of Baba. We got a nice section on Sarara, more broadly women and culture. And then we didn't quite get that delving into the fragility, which I think if we'd possibly got there, that would have taken us to the 5. And then, as you mentioned, interestingly, you mentioned that it was odd that they maybe didn't bring Hassan in. We sometimes get the opposite problem, actually. We sometimes get candidates bringing, obviously it's a critical incident in the text, but we did have responses last year where they focused solely on the rape scene of Hassan. And they didn't bring it out further, and they didn't bring it beyond that point in a particular response. And it kept them at that almost word level, because some candidates knew, obviously, that inciting incident very, very well. And then they weren't sort of able to link or track the character through the later stages of the novel. So yes, it's strange that answer doesn't deal with it all, but the reason we sort of picked that particular example is we've had candidates go too far the other way, and we've had candidates stay focused in on some events very early in the text and then not sort of moving on beyond that. Thinking through how could that 4 have become a 5? We could have had a little bit more technical. It was beginning to start to talk about things. It mentioned Baba was a tool, but it didn't really maybe explore that idea. We could have had more specifics, as you said, on the context. There was a little bit of narration creeping in a few places. It sounds a bit samey because we've got the same mark that we got in section A. This one got the 19. So we felt it did pretty well in level 4, but it wasn't ever sort of touching on 5. It wasn't quite that level of critical evaluation. It didn't have quite that range. It didn't have quite that confidence that we'd expect for a 5. If you are looking for 5s, never fear. The level 5s are on the website, and they will be, if we look in the exam insights booklets, and we have plenty of level 5s from this session from 2025. So if you're kind of wanting some level 5 exemplar, there's quite a few examples there for texts across the range, and in fact across all units. And yes, as you say, Mark, the idea that it needed a little bit more focus on the sense of narrative and prose methods. We weren't really getting that sense of the writer at work. I've mentioned already, if you go to the international A level part of the site, you've got the documents that you've received today, but there is, as we said, the exam insights is worth a look. They get updated every year, so you've got sort of a few of those now on the site. You've got other exemplar materials and SAMs, and there are obviously things like the past papers, the mark schemes there as well, that you can work with students in the way we mentioned today. And this idea that, as we said, the difference between maybe visiting the text, reviewing the text, and we mentioned this word explore that keeps coming up in the questions. 4 and above, we're hoping that candidates can explore the text and really get into this nitty gritty. And level 5, they're actually, as we say, scrutinizing, so they're thinking about, a secure sense, and they've got a discursive point, they're really sort of engaging with it at that level. And then, as we said, the sense of where you might want to go. We have the website itself, which has plenty of resources directly linked. So you've got the papers, the material, the past training. Recordings are there for you as well for anything that you might have missed. And I know some people have had some demands today with teaching. So if you want to go back and sort of go through any of these, we've got Results Plus for those of you who want to sort of go through that in-depth analysis of your own students and their own papers and sort of working through what that gives you. And that access to scripts, do sort of make sure you use that, and it gives you sort of a sense of where students are at and where we need to move through. We've got other resources and teacher resource packs that are available on the site as well, and we've got samples if anyone wishes to pursue that. And then a point of contact would be Claire Haviland, who is a subject partner for English. And if, for example, as today, if there's something that you want to see more of, or there's something you'd like a deeper dive into, Claire is maybe the one to contact, and she maybe looks at that in terms of future training. So if there's things that people would like to sort of spend more time on, do let Claire know, and then she sort of puts that down the pipeline for extra training. There is also the Professional Development Academy, and that's things that can be done at your own pace. So you don't always feel that you have to miss lessons. There's things on the website that can be sort of worked through and dipped in and out of. And again, the materials, they're organised in sort of a course plan, which can be quite useful. Newsletters, and then just as we go. And I know we're just finished. If there's any sort of key questions, and I know we're doing it through the quite robotic text boxes and chat boxes, a bit like please hold. But if there are any sort of pressing questions, thank you for staying. I realised that the session should have wrapped up there 4 minutes ago, so I do apologise if I'm holding anyone from break. But do have a wonderful end of term, and thank you again for attending at a busy time. And if there's any sort of urgent question or follow up that you need to put into the chat box, if you just let me know, and we can just check that before Moses closes the session. And I would just like to thank Moses for his support today. So thank you for the tech support and making it a smooth sailing. And thank you everyone for all of your participation. So do have a good day. Thank you. Yes, happy end of year to all of you and happy break if we're going on breaks. So thank you very much.